Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our presentation entitled Business Culture, Fiduciary Flags, Facts and the Future. I'm joined on stage today by Alice Joy and Steve Chandler, who will be presenting later, and you will note that Gillian is currently on maternity leave. However, fear not, she will be making a virtual appearance shortly, and we are delighted to announce the recent safe arrival of baby Browning, an event which was a key deliverable for the division this year. We hope that you find the next 40 minutes a valuable use of your time, and please note that we will have time for questions at the end of the presentation, so let's begin. You will have heard from William yesterday that the theme for this year's industry presentation is the interaction of business culture with regulation in the present decade. Applying this theme to our own presentation, we wish to spend some time under fiduciary flags, sharing some of the cultural indicators that we have observed this year and that we will continue to look for during our ongoing supervision next year. And this will be highlighted by a clip from Gillian sharing her thoughts with team members in this area. Under fiduciary facts, Alice will take a look at key trends in the sector and how these compare with recent years. Under the future, we'll hear from Steve Chandler on innovations, fintech, and the Lending, Credit and Finance project, which forms a key element of the division's responsibilities. And finally, I will return to give you an overview as to what you can expect from the division next year in a little more detail, and I'll also give you some clues on next year's thematic review. The key message we would like you to take away today is that we are working together to ensure the culture of the bailiwick supports good quality business. We thought that today may provide a useful opportunity to share with you the fiduciary team and divisional structure. Hopefully, thanks to a number of initiatives, not least our quarterly open breakfasts, you will recognise a number of the names. The open breakfasts have been extremely well supported throughout 2016 and will continue to run as a useful opportunity for informal dialogue on current themes and initiatives. Gillian and I would like to take this opportunity to thank each member of our team for their incredible support and commitment through what has been another extremely busy year. We'd also like to thank you, our licensees, for your support in providing returns, feedback, and for hosting site visits this year. And finally, we would like to thank the GAT Committee for their continued and valued engagement. Indeed, throughout our presentation, you will hear a number of initiatives where the division and GAT are working closely together, and we are grateful for this partnership. Before I hand over to Gillian, I wanted to provide a brief overview of this year's thematic on client money. Our rationale for choosing this topic was that we felt it is an area which followed on logically from last year's theme, which looked at fiduciary decision-making in respect of assets under trust. Secondly, the thematic provides a useful opportunity for us to conduct a litmus test of standards and practice regarding client money, particularly in light of crystallised risks in the sector. As ever, thematics provide us with a good opportunity to understand current practices and challenges faced by local firms and to share these with you in the industry. And finally, it enabled us to assess the need for client asset rules to ensure that the jurisdiction complies with international standards going forwards. And these rules are currently being progressed. Therefore, you should expect to see a consultation paper early in the new year, and we continue to liaise with GAT in this area. Turning to the thematic process, similar to last year, a questionnaire was sent to all full fiduciary licensees, which addressed the following key areas: client money accounts and their operation, banking arrangements in place for local firms, procedures, controls and staff training, handling of breaches and overdrafts, and finally, AML arrangements, and I'll provide some feedback on these in the next slides. We subsequently conducted on-site visits to 8 licensees who were chosen to provide a cross-section of the sector with differing PRISM impact ratings, different sizes of firms, and different ownership models. And we purposefully included a bank-owned business. And again, thank you to those firms who were the lucky winners of a visit. As stated, the aim of the thematic is to share good practice and to identify areas for improvement. And we expect to issue our reports shortly. So what did we see? Under client money accounts and their operation, we saw that approximately 2/3 of firms have procedures in place for determining whether a particular banking institution is appropriate to hold their clients' funds. The on-site visit programme also showed that in practice, firms were actively discussing the suitability of banks at board level. Indeed, one firm had been sufficiently concerned to write to all clients regarding a particular banking institution and were considering their ongoing relationship with that bank at the time of our visit. 69% of firms indicated that they had documented policies, procedures, and controls in place for the operation of client money accounts. Of those that didn't, the vast majority had other controls in place in order to control the movement of client funds. The firms visited were also able to demonstrate compliance with the majority of the GIFIC standards in this area, even if the process by which they met a particular standard wasn't necessarily fully documented. And finally, on the subject of AML arrangements, over 80% of firms receive full CDD prior to accepting client funds into a structure. The outlier being perhaps the International Financial Group, where approximately 65% of firms here receive full CDD. So to wrap up this section in terms of timelines, as mentioned earlier, we expect to issue the full report shortly. Shortly you will hear from Alice, who will provide an overview of the facts and figures relating to the fiduciary sector. However, without further ado or pregnant pause, let's first hear from Gillian as she shares her thoughts on fiduciary cultural red flags.
So before I go on maternity leave, I just want to take this opportunity to review what we've seen in the licensees we've visited this year and to give a bit of a steer on what I'd like you to focus on site visits next year. Now, given the theme of this year's industry presentation is all about culture, I'm going to talk through a number of red flags I'd like you to keep an eye out for when you're visiting firms next year. And these all revolve around the concept of culture. Now, culture's tricky, not one size fits all. We've got fiduciary businesses that all have different ownership structures. They all have different leadership strategies. They're all different. But what we have seen over the last few years is where firms who have a poor culture have had issues arise out of them. So culture really matters. It's something we need to take seriously and look at. So the first area I'd like us to talk about is business model. As ever, money matters, and I'd recommend you continue to follow the money in the firms that you go and visit. The fiduciary businesses are ultimately all about fiduciary relationships, and where a firm turns that relationship into a professional service, something that they have to charge fees for, can often prove a bit of a problem and can cause its own challenges. And we've seen examples of poor conduct where firms have put staff under pressure to deliver particular returns or targets. So when you go on an on-site, have a look at exactly what the firm is being paid for, exactly what services they're charging for, and how transparent those charges are. Have a look at how those fees and charges are being calculated, and then how many of the fees and charges are recoverable, how much time is recovered, and how much staff time is chargeable. Perhaps have a look at how the directors are remunerated. Are any of them remunerated on the basis of the business that they brought into the firm? And if they are, then how do they square that with their fiduciary duty? Also, when you're looking at fees, have a look at whether they're particularly cheap when they take on the business, whether they might be high at exit. Look at the pattern of fees over the life cycle of their time with that particular trust structure. The second area I'd encourage you to look at is around financial outliers. Now, we've seen regulatory issues emerge out of businesses where they're an outlier on one end of the spectrum or the other, either because they're operating with profit margins far in excess of their peers. Now, that might indicate that they've not been investing in compliance in the way that perhaps some of their peers have. Or we've seen outliers where the firm's making little or no profit whatsoever. Where they're making very little profit, they might be more susceptible to taking on higher risk business, or perhaps being more at the control of a dominant settler. So look out for that.
I think our thematic reviews have been especially helpful in identifying outliers in that area.
Yeah, I agree. Our thematics are really useful for doing that, for that peer comparison. So when you're on your on-site, continue to look at the licensee's assets under trusteeship versus turnover. What does that tell you? Are there any outliers there? Have a look at the firm's cost-income ratio and continue to look at whether they're making far more profit than some of their peers or less. The third area I wanted to cover was resourcing. Now, as you'll be aware, we have a number of licensees that are under-resourced, and this problem is only being exacerbated as the weight of global regulatory reporting increases. So we've seen, particularly for some firms where they don't have sophisticated automatic reporting software, there's a real administrative burden on them to comply with CRS and FATCA. And we're aware recruitment, particularly in the compliance field in Guernsey, and senior administrator, junior management level is pretty tricky.
I think this has been made worse for our licensees by the additional burden of CRS and FATCA.
Yeah, I agree with you. I appreciate it's a complicated subject, and we shouldn't overgeneralise here, but I recommend you review the firm's assets under trusteeship versus the number of employees they have. See if there's anybody who's standing out as managing a great deal of assets under trust and not having that many people at the firm. Have a look at how many staff are employed versus the number of director appointments that the firm holds. And also compare the number of directorships per director. Is one director taking on many, many multiples of directorships, and what's that tell you? Staff turnover is always interesting to look at, both the level of vacancies and where a vacancy exists. Have a look at how, if they're part of a wider group, how long that vacancy's been in existence for. Did they have to seek head office approval before they could fill that vacancy? How long did it take them to get authorisations from head office to fill that gap? Keep an eye on the level of experience and skills, particularly at board level, and particularly where a firm may be looking to move into a new market. We've seen firms who are looking to enter new areas, but they don't necessarily have the skills and experience among the people at the firm right now to enter that new market. Investment in training is always another good telltale sign. And finally, I encourage you to look at how much is outsourced. This is a subject that's come up over the years, it's familiar to us. We'll all be aware that whilst you can outsource a function, you can't outsource responsibility for compliance. I've been particularly struck by some consultancy agreements, and you might want to get actually into the detail of the consultancy agreement between the licensee and the outsourced compliance firm, because some of those agreements say we'll supply 2 hours a week compliance services, but the firm has got many number of high-risk clients, and you just know they're not going to be able to do the job that's required. Moving on to the ownership model, I think part of the strength of the fiduciary sector is really its diversity. We have all sorts of different types of ownership models here, but each of those will come with their own challenges. They'll come with their own.
I'm due to visit a locally owned fiduciary that's managed by its controllers. What should I be looking at particularly as they're due to retire soon and are looking for an exit strategy?
Yeah, there is. I definitely look at their succession plans. How are they planning to exit the business? What are the details of their exit strategy? And what pressure do you think that exit strategy is going to place on their business? Heaven forbid, could there be any window dressing going on before they actually are looking to sell? You mentioned that they're locally owned.
Yes.
It's always worth having a look at the balance of the board. Is the one director who's more dominant than the others? And how are those board discussions filtered down into the organisation itself? And does the cultural tone transcend further than just the board discussions? And often an issue with some of the locally owned firms is the lack of independence, independent oversight. Is there an independent non-exec director there? How effective is that NED? Do they actually provide real challenge to the board? And does find out if the NED fulfills any other roles at the firm. We have seen some NEDs fulfilling MLRO functions as well, and I find that's a bit hard to square how they can fill those two functions. Any other visits coming up?
Yes, I'm due to visit a fiduciary business owned by a private equity firm, and I was wondering what I should look out for.
So private equity firms, completely different business model to the locally owned example. It's always fascinating to look at what the tone from the top is, how is it set, and then how's that filtered down. In the private equity example, have a look at their longer term strategy. What was their specific rationale? Explore what their specific rationale was for purchasing that business. And what investment returns, if any, are they seeking to get, and over what timescale? On a cultural perspective, it's interesting to look at how happy the marriage was effectively between the acquirer and the target firm. Was it a cultural partnership, or are the two different cultures coming in, and how's that working as they embed together? I think for private equity owned firms, it's good to delve into exactly how fiduciary decisions are taken. Do you ever see any examples of where there might be a conflict between the private equity return that's demanded and the local day-to-day decisions, and how does that play out through board minutes or through the discussions they have? And also continue to be alive to where the investment is in the life cycle of the private equity firm. They may or may not want to hold the firm as an asset forever. If they're looking to exit, just be conscious of how long they've had that particular investment. So lastly, information security. You'll be aware this has been a rising issue over the last few years, and it's attracted a great deal of attention over particularly the last year. News items like around Mossack Fonseca Panama Papers leaks, and more recently the leak of the Bahamas company registry data is fresh in all of our minds. All of these data leaks lead to increased attention and scrutiny on us as an international finance centre, and we cannot underestimate the importance of our licensees holding data securely. Any questions about data security, information security?
We're not the Data Information Commissioner. Why does this matter?
I think information security is a good opportunity to delve down into our assessment of a licensee's operational risk capacity and capabilities. It can really be a deep dive for you when you go on an on-site. So explore whether operationally they have policies and procedures in place if they're subject to an attack. If they have policies and procedures in place, are they effective? Have they ever been used? Have they been tested? Have the firm got an incident recovery plan? If they've been subjected to an attack, have they let us know what happened after they were subjected to an attack? I'd also explore whether the firm itself thinks that information security is just a matter for the IT guy who's sat in a darkened cupboard somewhere, or if it's something that the board as a whole are responsible for. And see what does that tell you about the culture of the firm and the way things are done around here, the way things are done in the firm. So I guess just to wrap up, because I've kept you here for long enough, I'd say this isn't an exhaustive list of all the things I want you to look at on sites over the next 6 to 12 months, but I hope it'll give you a steer on some of the red flags that we can look for in terms of culture. I'll probably come back to where I started at the beginning. It's often about the money. Have a look at how the firm and the directors and the employees are remunerated. See how that drives behaviour. Good luck. Okay.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We thought it would be useful to share some key trends and statistics which we received from a combination of your 2016 annual returns and your aggregated financial statements. The slide shows a slight increase in the number of people employed in the sector, reflecting a similarly sized increase in employment across Guernsey. To set the scene, from 2016 government statistics, there are currently 32,291 people employed in Guernsey. Of these, some 3,526 work in the fiduciary sector, which is nearly 11% of the island's workforce, an impressive number. In the earlier video clip, Gillian discussed with the team key red flags to focus on during our 2017 on-site visit programme. Staffing and resources is always a key focus of our on-site visits. It can be tricky for our on-site teams to really get under the skin of a firm during a week-long full risk assessment. But data such as turnover of staff, coupled with information on the length of time a vacancy is left unfilled, can really give us a flavour of a firm's culture. This slide shows the number of fiduciary appointments per full-time member of staff, split between all staff and staff carrying out regulated activities. In her briefing to the team, Gillian touched on the importance of recognising whether staff are overstretched as an indicator of operational risk. The average number of appointments per member of staff for the whole sector is 14.76. Licensees in the privately owned local category have an appreciably higher average number of appointments of 19.61 per member of staff compared to the other ownership categories. And this will be a focus of our on-site visits to these firms in 2017. The concentration of appointments in the hands of one director can suggest dominance and potentially present a key man risk. Can also be a flag of difficulties with succession planning in an emergency scenario and over the longer term. This slide shows the value of assets under management that each member of staff is responsible for, again split between all staff and staff carrying out regulated activities. What is striking to me is the large variation between the different ownership categories of fiduciary licensees, with staff at international finance groups responsible for 60% more assets than staff at businesses classed as privately owned overseas. These charts illustrate the stability of the assets managed by fiduciary licensees. You will note that there has been a slight decrease in the percentage of assets held as liquid and near liquid assets since 2015. This may reflect a growing confidence as licensees feel they can reduce their cash safety nets and may reflect a greater demand to seek a return on assets held. You can see that the class Other Diverse Assets has seen a corresponding increase. We were surprised to note an increase, albeit small, in the percentage of real estate held. It will be interesting to monitor next year's figures to understand the impact of de-enveloping and other HMR initiatives on the assets held by our fiduciary licensees. This slide shows a slight overall increase in the value of assets under administration by fiduciary licensees, with fiduciary licensees owned by international finance groups enjoying significant growth in the value of assets under administration, countered by smaller increases for lawyers and accountants, and licensees owned privately and overseas. The slide also shows the total number of fiduciary licensees is 154, a change from 155 last year, reflecting stability across the sector. You will note a minor decrease in the number of full fiduciary firms owned by lawyers and accountants, and those firms owned privately and locally. And this is offset by the small growth of firms owned by international finance groups and privately owned overseas businesses. As shown by the earlier video, consolidation and its impact on our fiduciary licensees is a frequent topic within the team. When the Fiduciaries Division and Authorisations Unit consider a change of control application, we assess the ability of the new owners to meet the minimum criteria for licensing and try to understand the new owner's strategy for the business. When the Fiduciary Division carries out an on-site visit to a firm subject to consolidation, we consider the cultural impact of the new owners. It is interesting to note that high-level group discussions about strategy can really filter down to staff on the ground in Guernsey, with it soon becoming obvious as to when the group sees a long-term focus for Guernsey. As Gillian reminded the team in the video, interviews with staff or examination of sickness and absence data following a consolidation soon reveals firms where staff are being put under undue pressure to deliver returns or targets. This slide relates to the number of new client relationships generated in the past year and is taken from your annual returns. There has been a 30% increase in new business coming from Russia as compared to 2015. This was from a low base, but perhaps reflects the political and economic instability that persists there. The Middle East also saw a very healthy increase in new business opportunities for our Guernsey fiduciary licensees, with a 29% increase, again from a low base. You will note that a fairly substantial amount of new business is designated as other. The current annual return does not allow firms to record explicitly where this new business is coming from. Anecdotally, we hear of opportunities in South Africa, but as a bailiwick, we would like to get better data on where new business is coming from. As such, Simon Taylor has begun a project to review the information we receive through the annual return, and we will be working with industry and GAT over the coming months to deliver this. This will see some changes to the annual return form, which will migrate to an online submission. I'll now hand over to Steve.
Thank you, Alice, and good morning, everyone. I should like to talk briefly about the Lending, Credit and Finance project. The project has two principal objectives. Firstly, to introduce consumer lending and credit protection. Basically, we are proposing to implement prudent controls aimed at protecting the financially vulnerable. The second objective is to provide clarity on the regulatory and legislative requirements for innovative financial lending services, and it is this subject that I would first like to talk about. It is widely acknowledged that innovation is not a new phenomenon. However, the rapid pace of change that technology is enabling is transforming the market. Examples seen are in the emergence of challenger banks, robo-advisors, differing payment options, and smart contracts. Basically, technology is delivering alternatives to legacy business models, processes, and delivery channels. In essence, technology is enabling faster, cost-effective options. The subject which is possibly receiving the most attention is the blockchain's distributed ledger technology. Through its power to transform ledgers as tools to record, enable, and secure an enormous range of transactions, distributed ledger technology is undergoing progression from its initial purpose of being the underlying technology for digital currency to larger scale adoption. Distributed ledger technology is seen as an alternative enabler for new products and services, or the means to enhance existing ones. The opportunities arising through the various alternative products and services is unsurprisingly attracting attention as businesses and customers are keen to take advantage of the benefits. While there may appear to be minimal development at this stage, there is significant investment being undertaken. Businesses have been quick to identify that the rewards are high, but equally it is a highly competitive world, which is intensifying through the demand to deliver quickly so as to capture market advantage. The dichotomy that this presents is that the advances occurring are challenging, disrupting, and even opposing legacy legislation and regulation that cannot react and respond at an equal level of speed. However, this should not be seen as a limiting factor to development. The Commission recognises that we need to support and encourage new financial products and services, as this is in the interests of industry and consumers. One means by how we intend to add our support is through the Innovation Soundbox, and I would like to talk further on its aims and objectives. A number of jurisdictions around the world have established innovation hubs, and while we do not have comparable resources to other large jurisdictions, the Innovation Soundbox is our equivalent means by which entrepreneurs and innovators can meet with us and learn about the bailiwick's regulatory landscape. We are keen to encourage a dialogue, as often the developers and creative people behind an innovative proposition are unfamiliar with the legislative and regulatory requirements of the bailiwick, and therefore there is a distinct advantage to discuss a proposition, especially at an early stage, because often the propositions presented are diverse and test the boundaries of existing legislative and regulatory requirements. The Innovation Soundbox is designed to serve as a cross-commission hub for inquiries regarding innovative financial products and services, so as to provide a steer on the bailiwick's regulatory requirements. It is equally important that the overall product or service is appropriate and not one that has the potential to damage the bailiwick's reputation. Clarity of the regulatory landscape is a reason that innovation is included within the lending, credit and finance project scope. Sorry. A quick recap on the proposed model. The first category is red milk. The suggested criteria is that for firms that are providing lending, credit and finance, they will have full registration. The second category is the blue milk. We are suggesting a form of limited license. The suggestion is for this criteria to include innovative FSBs not included under the protection of investors law, firms that provide ancillary services to lending, credit and finance businesses, and those firms that provide purely credit products and services. The third category, the green milk, is for those firms who should be registered only, as they do not conduct any form of lending, credit and finance. For example, there are currently in the NRFSB law categories for providing safe custody and providing advice on industrial strategy related questions on mergers. Finally, there is a fourth category, which we describe as the empties. These are the instances where it's appropriate to exclude some sensible items. Excluded items would be those where there is little regulatory risk, and it would be overzealous to include certain activities or transactions in the scope of the suggested new law. Examples are the bus travel card and utility structured debt purchases. I should now like to speak briefly about the lending, credit and finance project's timescales and its next steps. This slide depicts the project timeline since its inception. With regard to the project's next stages, you will note on the slide that the next objective is to conduct a follow-up survey of the activities conducted by NRFSB firms. The reason is that the current NRFSB population consists predominantly of firms involved in lending, credit and finance, and therefore we are seeking their assistance to collate data and information that is representative of the existing businesses conducted. This data will be valuable as we progress to the next stage of the project, which is to issue a consultation paper when we outline in more detail the proposals for the new law. As noted on the project timeline, the discussion paper response period is closed, and we are currently analysing the feedback provided to us following the discussion paper. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank those of you who replied to the paper, and also to everyone who participated in the focus groups, who were instrumental in helping design and develop the discussion paper's proposals. The focus groups consisted of a cross-section of representatives, and we will continue to engage and involve stakeholders in future stages of the project. If you missed the opportunity to read the discussion paper, it can still be accessed on the Commission's website, although the online response system is now closed. Finally, if you'd like to see more about the Innovation Soundbox, we have published details on the Commission's website, together with a means to contact us. Thank you, and I'll now hand back to Eamon.
Thanks, Steve. So this brings us to the final part of the presentation, where we take a look at what you can expect from us for next year. Well, as Catherine touched on earlier, our primary objective remains the same, which is to execute high-quality, risk-based, prudential, financial crime and conduct regulation, which places PRISM and risk-based supervision firmly at the heart of all that we do. Again, this will be delivered via a series of full risk assessments and engagement visits, and indeed another thematic review. But broadly, 2017 should look much like 2016. Other informal engagement will continue, for example, the open breakfast that we've talked about, meetings arising from the Innovation Soundbox, and indeed other ad hoc meetings in response to various issues as they arise. Thematics will continue. And also, as Steve has just told us, the Lending Credit and Finance project remains a key objective, both for the division and indeed the wider bailiwick. A number of cross-commission policy work will continue, including progressing with the revision of laws project. And Andy Sloan has recently issued a discussion paper regarding the implementation of pensions regulation to the bailiwick. And the Fiduciary division sits on the working group of that project, with Roger Berry and Stephen Ainsworth representing the local industry. Our divisional policy work will also continue, with May Rondell leading the way on a number of issues here, including private trust company guidance note and a specific application form for discretionary exemptions, personal fiduciary licenses, where we are working with GAT, GIFA and the NED Forum to provide greater clarity around the up to 6 directorships and applicable exemptions. Regarding the financial resources requirement, we are seeking to bring it in line with the GIFIC standard, and GAT again are assisting us with review at the moment. And PII cover is also being considered in line with the GIFIC standard. As mentioned earlier, the development of client asset rules is well underway, and a discussion paper expected shortly. And finally on this slide, and in order to ensure Guernsey continues to be regarded as a credible contributor to international regulatory policy in the TCSP space, we continue to play a central role with the development of the GIFIC standard and the associated strategic implementation. By now you'll be aware that a key part of PRISM is an annual thematic review per sector. Each year we highlight a number of potential topics. The 3 completed topics are now shaded grey to the left-hand side of the screen, leaving you with 5 potential themes for next year. So take a good look. To reiterate a note of caution, not all thematics will follow the same process. Although this year's was similar to last year's, next year's may look and feel different. But they always improve our understanding of risks in a certain area and facilitate identification and understanding of emerging risks, and may be conducted as discussed with other divisions. To conclude the presentation for this year, the key message we would like you to take away is that we are working together to ensure the culture of the bailiwick supports good quality business. Thank you for listening. Myself, Alice and Steve will be happy to take your questions.